I am delighted to welcome today Professor Gilbert Meilander, a mentor and friend to me personally for a number of years. Professor Meilander is Senior Research Professor at Valparaiso University. Over about 40 years he taught at the University of Virginia, then at Oberlin, then at Valparaiso, where he held the Duesenberg Chair in Christian Ethics. He did his MDiv degree from Concordia Seminary in St. Louis and his PhD from Princeton University. Dr. Meilander is the author of many books and articles in the field of Christian ethics. He writes on a wide array of topics in Christian ethics. Among those are a book titled Friendship, a Study in Theological Ethics. And among his many books are a few books on bioethics, or several books on bioethics, including Bioethics, a Primer for Christians, which I certainly commend to folks who want an introduction to how to think as a Christian about the world of bioethics. He also was co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Theological Ethics. Dr. Meilander has been really in the thick of public discourse and debates about bioethics, and particularly, I think about his service for several years on the President's Council on Bioethics in the 2000s. That was enormously productive and also became kind of a flashpoint for debates about the nature and character of medical ethics and about how background beliefs might shape reasonably people's ethical decisions. He served on the Hastings Center as well, and today is going to speak to us about background beliefs and bioethics. Welcome, Professor Meilander.
Thank you, Farr. I'm glad to be here, even though I'm not sure where here is, actually, when we work this way. I suspect that most of you are more familiar with it than I am. I'm just very old-fashioned, but I'll do my best to see if we can accomplish something here. I wanted to talk, the title for this talk is Background Beliefs in Bioethics, and I need to take a little time here at the start just to sort of try to say what I mean by that. And then I'll try to talk about a couple areas in which I think background beliefs are important. But let me just sort of try to work my way into this briefly at the start. The first bioethics think tank in this country, though actually almost nobody used the word bioethics in those days. They talked more about medical ethics, but the first think tank was the Hastings Center. It was founded in 1969, so we're talking about a half century or so ago. And when the center was founded, they planned to do research in 4 areas. Those 4 were first death and dying and related questions about trying to extend the lifespan, for instance, things like that. Second was behavior control, and connected with that, even questions about whether, for instance, we should try to see if we could make people happy by administering a pill, that sort of concern. The third was genetic screening, counseling, and engineering, as it was called, which included more generally questions about procreation and kinship and so forth. And the last one, the fourth, was population policy and family planning, which included our relation to future generations and responsibilities there. Now, as I said, we're half century later now. And if we added to that list of 4, if we added explicit attention to moral problems connected to experimentation and questions about access to healthcare, the list could probably serve pretty well still today as a brief itemization of the central concerns of bioethics. The last couple of years, almost everybody who considers himself or herself a bioethicist has wanted to write about the pandemic, but that's been sort of absurd in the conversation. I think that the list of those 4 plus research ethics and healthcare access does get at on the whole, the kinds of questions that bioethicists have been concerned about from the start. So in one sense, you could say that not a lot has changed. Here we are, we find ourselves 50 years or so later. And roughly, I think the list would still be similar. And yet, in another way, I think a great deal has changed in how we think about and approach these questions. In those early years, there really weren't people who called themselves bioethicists. What there were people who worked in other fields, academicians, physicians, some lawyers, though the lawyers tended to come in a little later in the process, people who worked in various fields and who, for one reason or another, were drawn to the questions that were just beginning to emerge in the world that we came to call bioethics. And some of those scholars, in fact, some pretty important ones in the early years, were people who worked in religious traditions, more of them than philosophers at first, I think, at the time. So names like Paul Ramsey, Richard McCormick, Bill May, Seymour Siegel, Jim Gustafson, these were all academicians who worked on religious questions, wrote about them and so forth, and now brought that kind of background to bear on the questions that were emerging in the field of bioethics. And even Daniel Callahan, who was the co-founder of that first bioethics center, the Hastings Center, had been a Roman Catholic, though he'd sort of drifted away from that, but he still sort of appreciated the kinds of concerns that those thinkers brought to it, and that was important to him. So for these sorts of thinkers, one approached bioethics problems always in the context of other, sometimes complex, deeper religious beliefs that shaped how one thought about them. They didn't have a simple system to think these questions through. There wasn't some single ethical approach that they used. They came from various almost metaphysical and religious angles to think about the problems. Today, though, a way in which, even though we may have the same issues that we work on, we come at them differently. I think it's fair to say that a great deal of the most influential work in bioethics, some of it very good, in fact, by very fine scholars, simply involves the application of a few basic principles to whatever problem we're taking. So it's not at all uncommon to have people simply thinking in terms of a few principles like autonomy, beneficence, justice. You take your problem, you slot it into the grid with those principles, try to figure out how they apply to it, and you hope get some kind of answer to how one ought to approach whatever issue you're thinking about. So whatever the particular issue is, we just slot it into a ready-made ethical system and try to find an answer. And one of the possible advantages of this, purported advantage anyway, is that we may be able to reach consensus on what we ought to do. The problem is that often the consensus is pretty thin. It's a kind of lowest common denominator, a consensus that we get, but it's common to work that way. Now, what I think and what I'm going to suggest in sort of the underlying premise of this little talk is that it doesn't really work to apply principles in a vacuum, even though these are smart people doing it, and they're thoughtful. Because if you have a little system of principles, what we do with those moral principles will depend on what I'm calling background beliefs, beliefs that we just sort of carry along with us, we bring with us whenever we set to work to think about a particular problem. These are very general beliefs sometimes, beliefs about the meaning of human life, about birth and death, coming into being and going out of being, the relation between parents and children, the significance of suffering. All of us have beliefs about those things. Our views on particular questions and particular issues are shaped by those beliefs that we have, even though we probably fairly seldom bring those beliefs to sort of full articulation. They're just back there somewhere in us without really being fully articulated. We just take them in with the air we breathe. We drink them in perhaps from the culture around us. If you're lucky, maybe you learned them on your mother's knee. There are all sorts of ways that we come to get them, but they're back there. We carry them along with us, and they influence what we think. Everybody has such background beliefs. Not everybody wants to admit it, but everybody does. And what I want to do is just try to think a little bit about just a few, 3 areas in which I think these sorts of beliefs are important. They're important for everybody, though I'm interested in doing it primarily in the way in which they affect a Christian vision of the world and how we think about it, which may often be a little different from the background beliefs at work in our culture at large. I want to emphasize that what I'm not trying to say is that if you just get clear on your background beliefs, that you'll have a system that solves all the bioethical problems that come along. No, this is not just supposed to be a different system that we're proposing. It's just trying to enrich our thinking about these problems. Sometimes, in fact, it may be that extending our thinking into this deeper religious and metaphysical territory will make the problem seem more complicated. In fact, that's not impossible at all. So I'm not thinking in terms of some neat little system that will by itself solve various problems, but trying to think about beliefs that we have that are important, even though we may not be quite sure how they're integrated into a kind of a single moral theory. So that's what I want. I want to talk about 3 areas now and just try to say a little in each of them. And then we can talk about them if you've got anything to say about it. First of them is what I'm going to call the unity and integrity of the human person. If we try to think of a human being as an integrated whole, we quickly run up against a particular kind of problem. You could call it various things, but what I'll call it is the sort of the seeming duality of person and body, of the relation between person and body. And just think of some examples of the kind of problems that we might worry about. Suppose a child is born who throughout his life will be profoundly retarded. Or suppose an elderly woman who has now become severely demented. Suppose because of trauma of some sort, a person lapses into a persistent vegetative state. We ask ourselves, how should we describe these human beings? They're clearly living human organisms, right? How should we describe them? We might say, quite a few people will say today, we might say that they are living human beings, obviously, but they're not persons. They lack what we have come to call personhood, a term that has risen to prominence in bioethics over this half century we're talking about. They're living bodies, of course, that's sure, but they're bodies from whom it seems as if the person is almost wholly absent. And once we start to think this way, if we think this way, then it's clear that the class of human beings will be a larger class than the class of persons. Not all human beings will be persons. And if we tend, as we often do, to ascribe rights to persons, then there are going to be some human beings who are going to be in a kind of no man's land there, and we're not going to be quite sure how we should think about them. I said we've come to think this way. The language of personhood has become very important. We tend to distinguish between persons and human beings in this way, but we do not have to think that way. You don't have to carry that belief along with you when you come to bioethical questions. I like the phrase that St. Augustine uses in his City of God. He describes the human being as what he calls in his Latin, terra animata, that's the animated earth. Now, that's a background belief that we can bring along with us when we think about moral problems, and in particular, when we think about those several kinds of people who are living human beings, but might be thought to lack personhood. We can think about them on the one hand as human beings who lack personhood. If we think of them more from that Augustinian starting point, we might think of them instead simply as severely disabled persons, which is quite a different category finally. Similar questions arise, of course, with embryos and fetuses. Our public discourse has been bothered by that question and disrupted by it for a long time now. And it's in fact there that the language of personhood really first became, I think, prominent in bioethics. See, are those embryos and fetuses, are they human organisms that have not yet achieved personhood, or are they just the weakest and most vulnerable of human persons? Well, we all carry along with us beliefs that will incline us in one or another of those directions, but we need to try to think carefully about what those beliefs are that we have and what their implications are for these questions. If living human beings are animated earth, then the living body is the place of personal presence. It's in the living body that you find the person, and we don't have any access to the person apart from that living body. And so our personal histories then, precisely as the histories of animated earth, our personal histories do not necessarily require the presence of so-called personal capacities throughout. And we need to at least consider that as a possibility. Our histories begin in dependence, first within our mother's womb, and then when we're first newborns. And we have very few of those important personal capacities on display at that time. And often, alas, our histories may end in a kind of dependence in which there, again, aren't very many of those capacities present, even though we once had them. But if you think of the human being simply as an integrated whole from the start, as animated earth, then you might say that all the way along, we're persons from zygote to irreversible coma. We're living persons. That's at least a possible way to think if you carry along with you certain kinds of beliefs. So if that is the sort of background belief we carry along with us, we won't think of personhood as something that we have at some points along the way in life and don't have at other points. We'll think that dependence and lack of certain capacities is simply part of a person's life. That doesn't mean we have to like it or look forward to it. I'm not saying that we should all look forward to being dependent and losing a lot of our capacities. I'm farther along the way toward that than many of you probably are, but we don't have to like it or want it, but it does mean that we need to think about how to think about it. We need to pay attention to how we and others think about such issues. We need to be careful what views are shaping our approach to different issues. And I think the problems of bioethics, if we really go to work on them, will force us to ask what we think a human person really is, to reflect upon the unity and the integrity of the person, about the moral meaning of bodily life, what it means that we're embodied beings, whether the body is simply a carrier of something else, and it's that something else that really counts, or whether we really are animated earth, living bodies. We do have beliefs about such questions. We all do. As I say, we carry them along with us, even if we very seldom specifically mention them, and they're going to make a difference in how we approach many issues in bioethics, and we should therefore try to be self-conscious about that and think about it. So that's the first sort of kind of topic that I wanted to accent, a place where these sorts of background beliefs are important. Now, a different one, what I'll call the relation between the generations. If we really are embodied spirits, or actually if you take Augustine's animated earth language, what we are is inspirited bodies, I guess. But if we really are that, then the biological bond that connects the generations should have some kind of moral meaning for us, or at least we would think that it should. And it is, I think, fair to say that several different aspects of medical advance in reproductive technologies, in genetic screening, one day perhaps in techniques for germline editing or cloning even. These sorts of techniques have made it more complicated, more difficult for both parents and children simply to accept the bond between the generations as kind of given, as a gift, that locates and identifies us. What once might have seemed have come to us naturally as a way of thinking, it does not necessarily come that way always any longer. I want to read you a poem. I don't know if it's not easy to listen to somebody read a poem, but it's my talk, so I guess I can read a poem. There's a wonderful image of the child as gift in a poem by Galway Connell that's titled "After Making Love, We Hear Footsteps." You have to get to the very end of the poem to get the image itself, but let me read the poem to you. For I can snore like a bullhorn or play loud music or sit up talking with any reasonably sober Irishman, and Fergus will only sink deeper into his dreamless sleep, which goes by all in one flash. But let there be that heavy breathing or a stifled come cry anywhere in the house, and he will wrench himself awake and make for it on the run, as now we lie together after making love, quiet, touching along the length of our bodies, familiar touch of the long married, and he appears. In his baseball pajamas, it happens, the neck opening so small he has to screw them on, which one day may make him wonder about the mental capacity of baseball players, and flops down between us and hugs us and snuggles himself to sleep, his face gleaming with satisfaction at being this very child. In the half darkness, we look at each other and smile and touch arms across his little startlingly muscled body, this one whom habit of memory propels to the ground of his making, sleeper only the mortal sounds can sing awake, this blessing love gives again into our arms. Now, it's a great poem, wholly apart from anything else. It's a wonderful poem, but it's that image that comes at the end, this blessing that love gives again into our arms, that image of the child as a gift, a blessing, a gift that is the fruition not of an act of rational will, but an act of love. That's one kind of background belief you can carry along with you when you think about the relation between the generations. It's not the only possible one. You can compare that with a way of thinking that basically thinks of the child as the parent's product or project that they've produced. If that's the way we think of the child as a kind of product produced by the parents, then having a child becomes a project that we undertake to satisfy ourselves and make our lives richer and more complete. And of course, then our desire may not be simply to have a child. It may be for a child of a certain sort, a child of a certain sex, a child with certain characteristics or capacities. All that may enter in, and of course has begun to enter into our thinking about children and the relation between children and their parents. Human cloning, were it possible, and I don't doubt that it may eventually become, though it's complicated, but cloning would, from one angle, bring to completion this image of the next generation as a product of rational will undertaken to fulfill our desires. You produce precisely what you want, till the child later on surprises you maybe, but you think you know exactly what you're getting. From another angle, of course, cloning might explode our understanding of the relation between parents and children, because we don't actually really know how to name the relation between progenitor and offspring in that case. But at any rate, here again, we can think in different ways. We can, and I think do, carry along different understandings and beliefs about something like this. And I'm not suggesting that there's some simple recipe for making decisions. Learn to think about it in one way and everything will be clear. It is complicated. Parents must, of course, exercise their reason and will to shape their children's lives. They don't just beget them and set them free. Parents do not and should not simply accept as given whatever disabilities, sufferings, or even sometimes just disappointments that come their children's way. So we certainly do have to shape our children in some respects, but it's still true, as almost every child realizes at some point, the conscientious parent's effort to nurture and enhance their child's life can be crushing. And it can make it difficult to accept the child simply as a blessing that love gives into our arms. Difficult to say simply, it's good that you exist, whatever your particular state or condition. And so here again, in terms of the relation between the generations, there are going to be background beliefs that shape the way we think about the relation between the generations and what we think about how best to think about all that. it's pretty obvious, I think, in our culture today that we carry around different beliefs. Those differences will make a difference when we think about the emerging technologies that are coming along and that are going to be very important in the next decades. The difference is not simply a difference between background beliefs that some folks in our culture carry around and background beliefs that Christians carry around with them, because you never know what background beliefs Christians are carrying along with them. You know, scratch the person sitting next to you in the pew, and you may find somebody who doesn't think of the child as a blessing love gives into our arms, but thinks in other ways. So it's important for us to at least be clear about what it is that we think and how that belief is shaping what we have to say about particular problems and issues that come along in bioethics. And then finally, a third area of life, what I'll simply call relief of suffering. Part of the sadness of human life is that we sometimes cannot and other times ought not to do for others what they fervently desire. With respect to the relief of suffering, the great quest of modern research medicine, with respect to that, this is all too obvious, I'm afraid. Some relief we're just unable to provide. We'd like to be able to, but we can't. And that very inability, in fact, gives greater impetus to our continued efforts to discover causes and cures of illnesses, fuels the kind of sense that research is an imperative that we must undertake in order to better life. But still, what we think about this is going to be shaped by our views about the place of suffering in human life and whether there are any possible limits on human freedom, whether there could be things that we ought not do, even if they were within our power. If we are animated Earth, we do have a certain freedom to make progress and to reshape things. We're animated. The anima is free of certain limitations, but we're also limited in some ways. We're Earth. We're finite beings that have limitations. And we can look at ourselves, we can look at human beings from both of those angles. Let me give you my favorite illustration of it. I overused this illustration, so you'll just have to pardon me if I've used it before, but it just works for me to try to see the sense in which the human being has a certain kind of freedom, a freedom to transcend old limitations, and yet is also has limits that perhaps ought to be respected. Here's the example. Drop me from the top of a 50-story building, and the law of gravity takes over just as much as it does if you drop a rock. Because we are finite beings. We're Earth. We're located in space and time. We're subject to natural necessities. But we are also free. We're anima. We're able to some degree, to some limited degree, to transcend those limits of nature and history. So as I fall all too quickly from that 50-story building, there are going to be truths about my experience that cannot be captured in, there's some equation about mass and velocity that I should still know. And there are going to be some truths about my experience that can't be simply captured in that kind of equation, because something different is happening in my fall than happens in the rock's fall. And it's different because this falling object is also a subject who is characterized by self-awareness, so that I can know myself as a falling object, which means that I can to some degree distance myself from myself, from that falling object. I cannot simply be equated with it, even though I am it. I am that falling object, yet I'm also free from it. That, I think, is part of what it means to be animated Earth, to be both of those somehow simultaneously. Now, if we think of ourselves that way, or try to think of ourselves that way, we may learn something about, or we may at least think of one way that we might think about medical progress and its worth and its limits. On the one hand, it could never be right just to oppose medical progress. Medical progress has a kind of forward thrust to it. There is something about it that is constantly transcending old limits, attempting to find new ways to relieve human suffering, and that's not bad. In fact, it's often good. All you have to do is imagine a a day when the dentist didn't have Novocaine, to realize that I'm grateful for somebody who wanted to transcend an old limit there. So that sort of forward thrust, that progressive push is an expression of our created nature, our created freedom from the limits of what is given. And we can think in terms of that. At the same time, though, we may also need to be prepared to say no to some exercises of human freedom. That never-ending forward push, that never-ending project of human self-creation, of sort of exercising our autonomy in the language that we like to use today, that project runs up against certain limits, or may run up against limits that are ultimate limits, the limit that is God. Now, to be sure, it's always going to be hard to state in advance the precise boundaries that ought to limit our freedom. And that's a problem, because it means that we have trouble saying no, but we must prepare we should be prepared at least to expect that there might be limits, and to anticipate them and be open to encountering them if they should happen to be there. So what that means, if you think this way, if you carry along such a belief about what it means to be a human being, means that there may be suffering which we could relieve, but ought not, because we can't find a way that we think is morally acceptable to relieve it. That's at least a possibility, not, we hope, a common occurrence, but a possibility. There may be children who could be produced through technological means, but ought not, because we think there's something wrong with the means being proposed. There may even be valuable knowledge that might be gained in certain ways, but ought not. Through you could learn a lot through use of unconsenting research subjects, for instance, but perhaps ought not. So that there may be limits of that sort. Now, this can go down hard sometimes. So great is our modern concern to relieve suffering that we may almost forget that there have been in the past perspectives from which that goal was never primary, not unimportant, but never primary. That was true of the ancient Stoics, for instance. They had a pretty harsh view of how we ought to think about suffering, but not just Stoics. Here's a Christian example that I think is worth thinking about. It's going to take a little while to get to the point of the example, but there are some sermons of St. Augustine that were first preached, we know, in the year 397, but they were lost then, lost for centuries, and only discovered in the year 1990. So they were lost for a long time. And Peter Brown, the great historian of late antiquity and author of a marvelous biography of Augustine, discusses these, and he notes that Augustine often had to preach at festivals of the martyrs, because at Augustine's time, even though the era of martyrdom, of Christian martyrdom, was past, that cult of the martyrs continued to be of profound importance to believers. It wasn't that far in the past, and it was important to them. Persecution was still a living memory. So these martyrs, for ordinary Christians, these martyrs were, Peter Brown says, they were the what he calls the muscular athletes and the triumphant stars of the faith, the kind of people you applaud when you watch their exploits. But Brown suggests if you read these sermons that were found of Augustine and preached at these festivals of the martyrs, what you actually see, he says, what you see Augustine doing is trying to make the example of the martyrs and their feasts less dramatic, trying instead to stress the daily drama of God's workings in the hearts and minds and lives of the average Christian. Why? Well, Brown says that because that average believer did not doubt that God's grace had been spectacularly displayed in the lives of the martyrs. That was a given. What the average believer doubted was that such heroism could possibly be displayed in his own rather less dramatic and more humdrum daily existence. So Augustine, Brown writes, points away from the current popular ideology of the triumph of the martyrs to the smaller pains and triumphs of daily life. Now, here's the payoff for bioethics. Brown gives an example from one of these sermons of how Augustine does this, and it's instructive. Augustine tells his hearers in this sermon, he says, God has many martyrs in secret. Sometimes you shiver with fever. You are fighting. You are in bed. It is you who are the athlete. Now, what's the point of it? Well, Peter Brown comments, he writes this: exquisite pain accompanied much late Roman medical treatment. Furthermore, everyone, Augustine included, believed that amulets provided by skilled magicians did indeed protect the sufferer, but at the cost of relying on supernatural powers other than Christ alone. They worked. To neglect them was like neglecting any other form of medicine, but the Christian must not use them. Thus, for Augustine, to liken a Christian sickbed to a scene of martyrdom was not a strained comparison. I just think it's a nice example. I mean, it's so far from our ordinary experience that it can give us something different to consider. What you see there, though, is a way of life that will be, in some respects, an outlook for which relief of suffering, however important and desired and desirable, is still not the overriding imperative of life. Sometimes you just had to suffer rather than use the magician's amulets. I'm not sure that all of Augustine's hearers always took his advice. If it would be the only congregation that ever did everything that they were told to do in a sermon, but it is a nice example of an approach to life in which though we want to relieve suffering, we don't think of that as the overriding imperative. So then, these are three examples where I think kind of beliefs that we carry along with us will make a difference in how we approach bioethical issues: the unity and integrity of the human person, the relation between the generations, and relief of suffering. Three aspects of life in which our background beliefs will matter and make a difference. And I think that's important for bioethics. Bioethics draws our attention to bios, to bodily life in all its complexity. And medicine, likewise, is a vocation in which one gets to attend to all the goods that characterize human bodily life: biological, rational, cultural, spiritual. That asks a lot of a person. And it might easily tempt any of us, whether as physician or as patient or just thinking about bioethical problems. It might tempt us to sort of try to find a simple theory for dealing with the issues that we face. You can see why it might be appealing and why we might be drawn to it. If you never felt the appeal of it, I think you should be able to resist the appeal sometimes, but if you never felt the appeal of it, I'd worry about you. We're bound to find it appealing. But in the end, I don't think it can really satisfy, because what we do with our theories is going to depend on what we believe about a bunch of other things that don't in the first instance seem to be about ethics in particular, but in fact make a great deal of difference in how we approach ethical questions. And so if we really want to try to do justice to the complexity of human beings, of human life, a complexity that includes always our relation to God, we will sometimes have to ask some kind of deeper metaphysical, religious questions about our place in the universe and the meaning of human life. And that's what I've tried to illustrate in these ways. So that's what I've got to say. I'll be happy to listen to you or talk with you now.
Thank you, Professor Meilander. To remind those who are participating, if you would like to ask Professor Meilander a question, please click on the reactions button and use the raise hand function, and then I'll call on you, and you'll get a message that you can turn on your camera. And I'm just going to get us started, Gil, with a question that picks up with the martyrs. Martyr means witness, and say a little bit, if you would, from maybe your own experience about it's not necessarily the tension, but the difference between the vocation to point out mistakes and point out error. I think about Augustine's in City of God just withering some of his interlocutors, but also the place of saying, hey, here's what we think a better way, and look at this way, and come join us in this way. See if you don't think this way makes more sense and really responds to what your heart is longing for. It seems like sometimes those two postures are at odds.
Well, they could be. They might be often. Since I like Augustine's City of God, I'm prepared to say that both postures are acceptable and needed on various occasions. But actually, where you started was nice. When I used the example from Peter Brown's use of those sermons, I hadn't been thinking about the fact that the word martyr means witness, but of course you're right that it does. And in a culture that, at least on some of these questions, perhaps simply increasingly is kind of tone deaf to what I at least would, without assuming that all of you must agree with me, what I would think Christians should probably think. Perhaps the best we can do sometimes is try to live faithfully in various ways, in the face of suffering, in the relation between the generations, in how we think about the human person. Try to live faithfully and hope that that bears fruit, not just for us in some way, but that it actually is a witness to others. And we tend to rely on argument. I mean, I spent my life teaching. After all, I went into the classroom day after day and worked through arguments a lot of times. And that's important. That's good. It probably accomplishes a little less than we think it does. Certainly, that's what we hope it does. And just the way we live can make a difference as well, and not even just to the surrounding culture, but even among right within the church you go to. You can be bolstered by people who live in ways that are surprisingly faithful sometimes. So I don't wish to underrate argument. I don't want to say something that would make the last 40 years of my life seem entirely unnecessary, but it's certainly not the whole story here. And doing our best just to live faithfully and seeing if anybody else finds it appealing is the worthwhile strategy.
I can't help but think of that First Peter's, set aside Christ in your heart as Lord, and then prepare to give an answer for the hope within you. There's something of that tenor of living with integrity. I mean, you've talked about it, Christians at least first ought to start to think clearly and act clearly, with and then be ready to answer questions folks have. Any questions from any of our other participants? James Rusthoven, great to see you. Welcome.
And great to see you and Dr. Meilander et al. I'm speaking from Ottawa, Canada. Oh. And I, just as a follow-up to Far's question and the subsequent discussion, COVID has brought up some very contemporary issues of witness. Perhaps you can call them martyrdom with respect to vaccination and the positions we as Christians have struggled with fellow Christians at times about should we be vaccinated and what does that mean morally? Could you comment on that, Dr. Meilander? I mean, I'm a very strong believer in vaccinations. I've had very brutal discussions with both relatives and neighbors. And yet what gave me comfort actually were people like Gary Ferngren and Rodney Stark's descriptions of the early martyrs of the plagues of the 3rd and 4th century, and what bishops like Cyprian did to encourage their believers not to run to the hills, but to actually not only take care of their pagan neighbors, but the bodies of their pagan neighbors. So could you just comment on, should we keep that mentality even today where the stakes are not nearly as gruesome and brutal as they were in the time of those plagues?
Well, that is a tough question, and as I'm sure you all know, the the discussions surrounding COVID have degenerated to a point where it's really hard to know how to have conversations about it sometimes. But yes, obviously we should keep that to some extent. Now you don't have to suffer unnecessarily. There was, at the very start of the pandemic, there was there was a brief period, I guess it was pretty brief, but a brief period in which there was this kind of sense that we were in it together. People had to look out for each other. There was even this rather brief time when younger people had to be careful for the sake of those old folks who were at a greater risk. I mean, there was a brief period of time when that was the case. And then all sorts of things began to happen. I don't think the people making public decisions always, either didn't make wise decisions or didn't communicate very well about them. It turned into a political argument of certain sorts and wasn't very fruitful, hasn't been very fruitful. And of course, it's been an argument even within Christian congregations. I mean, I don't know what your experience is like, but if you spend any time around clergy, you'll find that they're just tired of having people tugging at them from all sorts of different directions on this question. Some people wanting all sorts of careful protections, others thinking, why are we doing this? So that I think the first thing we need to do is to somehow recapture the sense that we're not, the point is not just to keep myself alive here. I always say, I mean, I don't mean to be flippant at all in saying this, but so mostly I only say it with my wife, but I'll say it here that none of these good Christians really wants to go and be with their Lord. We don't actually want to do that. Someday maybe it'll happen, but we'd like to postpone it as long as possible. And obviously, life is a great gift. It's a good thing. We should hang on to it. But a willingness to be to make some sacrifices there for the sake of others seems to me to be in order and almost required, it seems to me, for Christians, though once I put it that way, the hackles will go up in some places. But I don't know, that's just kind of a rambling answer. I've just been sort of at a loss to know how to address it. There's been a lot of writing by bioethicists, but it's all about technical questions. How to triage treatments in certain cases and so forth. And this is not unimportant, but it doesn't really get to the deeper issues that have caused so much consternation and disagreement. We lost those somewhere along the way and haven't recovered them. And expertise has taken an enormous hit, sometimes justifiably, I have to say. But we're just at a loss to know where nobody trusts anybody any longer in these questions, and we're just at a loss to know what to do. That's not a very helpful answer. I'm sorry. It is rambling, but
did you, Jim?
No, I find it very helpful actually, and it gets to the basis of, as Christians, how much do we consider the others as well as ourselves? Mm-hmm. Anyway, thank you very much. We appreciate
it. And Gil, maybe you could say a little more about background beliefs and bioethics. I could imagine a parallel title, background beliefs and the science. And it seems like what COVID,
as in trust the science, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that the COVID pandemic, one of the things that it's exposed is how much in trusting the science or interpreting the science depends on background beliefs. Your thoughts on that?
Well, it does. And the problem is now that we live in a world. Now, I don't actually, the rest of you don't, most of you don't know, Far knows that I am a technological Luddite, and I really don't live in the digital world, but most people do, and they are therefore getting their background beliefs from all sorts of places, a far wider range of places than would have been the case, I think, even just like 20 years ago, sort of. And so there are several people who will email my wife about something or other with respect to COVID or vaccines or the data that emerge, email her with stuff that they think is important to consider. She always relays it to me, and I say, well, where did it come from? That's always my first question. People get this stuff from everywhere, and it's part of our problem, really. And it means that it will not do for the experts, the supposed experts, just to say we're experts. It just isn't going to work any longer in this world. What will work, I don't know, but we dig ourselves deeper and deeper into certain positions to the point where we can't find our way out of it to a different set of background beliefs. Now, some people may have the right ones. That's okay, but at the whole start of the pandemic, which for a retired person who could stay home was not onerous. It wasn't great, but it wasn't onerous. And who doesn't even mind, person doesn't even mind wearing a mask and is never bothered by the masks. At the start, it didn't strike me this way, but as it went along, it seemed to me that the continued refrain of trust the science was actually undercutting the science. It was simply making people skeptics. Why do you keep telling me to trust you? And they're coming with a certain set of beliefs that it's impossible to break through. I don't know what you do about that. And there were serious beliefs here. Of course, there were serious arguments about among some fairly conservative Christians about vaccines and whether the vaccines were morally acceptable or not. I think the vaccines are morally acceptable, but I took those arguments seriously. But people who started from there then often, because of their doubts about the acceptability of vaccines, then branched out to become skeptics in all sorts of other ways. And pretty deeply entrenched, really, in my experience.
I'm going to ask one more question before we wrap up here. And that is, Gil, how does, when you use the language of background beliefs, you seem to be making a point that's crucial to recognize and unassailable. And yet, I recognize also that the appreciation in our time of the fact that, or I should say, the skepticism in our time of someone having a God's eye view has also been joined to a kind of almost radical skepticism, and in a sense that background beliefs can also affirm the privatization of morality. Everybody's got their background beliefs, everybody's got their way. So how do you go about dialoguing in the world of, let's say, medical ethics, to clarify that background beliefs are necessary without communicating that this is just a matter of personal values and you want to sustain yours?
Mm-hmm. That's a nice question. And actually, I probably should have said something about that at the start. I said to somebody, I don't remember a conversation it was yesterday, maybe it was at lunch that you were at, in fact, Far, but you think of all those student papers I read over the years. I really don't like to think about that, actually, but think about it. And how often it happened over the years, especially in the later years of my teaching, that a good student would, who was charged to write a paper explicating and analyzing somebody's position on something, say, would write really a very good paper, evaluating it carefully and so forth, giving their own analysis and criticisms. They had criticism and so forth. And then in the last paragraph would say, of course, this is only my opinion. You know, they'd worked really hard on this paper. They'd, in some cases, done a really good job, but they wouldn't dare want to suggest to you that you ought to share this opinion. It's theirs. And you no doubt have a different one, and you're just as entitled to it as they are. So it's true that that is a tendency in our culture. I mean, it's the inherent relativism of much of our world, which is, as we're beginning to see, quite easily combined with insisting that you're the one who's right, finally. But that's not really what I had in mind when and I guess I should have said something about more, what the reason and maybe background beliefs isn't the best word. You know, you can think of another one and write it up and we'll publish it under both our names, But what I have in mind is this, and this may be peculiar to my experience. I don't know, maybe I'm mistaken in what I'm thinking, but I find it fairly common that if you've got somebody like me whose views on certain questions clearly are shaped by some religious beliefs. I mean, I don't always rub your nose in it, but once in a while I do, and they're there. In my experience, it's not uncommon for that to engender a certain kind of suspicion in other people. You've got these beliefs, they're shaping your views. I'm just coming at the question afresh, thinking it through, presupposing nothing. It's in that context that I have wanted to insist that everybody carries around these beliefs with them of different sorts. We're not all self-conscious about it. We don't all bring them to full articulation, but they're there. There was, if I may digress to just tell a little story, there was a sort of wonderful moment in one of the meetings of one of the sessions of the President's Council on Bioethics. And in most of these sessions, we would have one or another person in who was an expert in some aspect of whatever we were working on to talk with us, and so forth. And there was a woman, and I can't remember exactly how it went, but in some way or other, and this was in that endless discussion of embryonic stem cell research that could not be settled very easily. But in some kind of question to her, I had clearly suggested that I thought those embryos were protectable, should be protected. And she didn't disagree with me. What she said, well, I'd have to think about that because I don't think I know anyone who thinks that. To which I said, well, you must broaden your horizons. But you can live in the world of your assumptions, your background beliefs, quite comfortably sometimes, never having to do what I call bring them to full articulation. That's really what I had in mind. And I just want to be clear that I'm not the only one walking around with these beliefs. But I think also, so that's one kind of concern I have. The other concern is just for the people sitting next to me in the pew who may not be as clear about what their beliefs are and what the implications of those beliefs are as they should be or need to be. So there's a kind of intra-Christian concern that I had in mind. And then that extra one about the folks who think that we're the only people walking around like this, and they're just pure reasoners, assuming nothing.
Yes. I think that intra and inter is a helpful way of thinking about those two modes of kind of calling the bluff or giving the lie to the presumption of a neutrality that's a facade, and then living up to and understanding and living out the substantive commitments of, in this case, of Christianity. Friends, we've come to the end of our time. Professor Meilander, thank you very much.